5 years after Gregory vanished, leaving Debra to raise their 2 kids alone, he called, asking to meet. He's broke and desperate, seeking reconciliation for an inheritance. But can Debra trust the man who shattered their family? 5 years ago, Debra woke up to an empty bed and a life shattered by one note on the kitchen counter. "I need space. I can't do this anymore." Those words in a hasty script were all that Gregory had left behind. No explanation, no goodbyes, just a void where their marriage and family once thrived. She had read the note 1,000 times, hoping against hope that this time she would find meaning in it, clarity. But the brutal truth was there. Gregory was gone. Debra had shared 12 years of her life with Gregory, believing they had built a solid partnership and loving family. They were parents to 2 children, Alexander, now 13, and Rachel, aged 9, who filled their house with laughter and love. Those years of joy disappeared when Gregory walked out the door with so many questions and a whirlwind of heartache for her. Often Debra reflected upon the man he used to be, the committed husband and the loving father. His memory was distorted in such pain and betrayal. He was not there. As months passed, Debra struggled desperately trying to hold everything together. Alexander felt the sting of his father's abandonment more than anyone else. He had turned from a bright, curious boy into a simmering pot of anger and resentment. His father's absence made him belligerent, with dark clouds hanging over his once merry spirit. Rachel, meanwhile, quietly handled her pain by retiring to her room, tears streaming down her face. It was there, with a tattered teddy bear pressed tightly in her arms and talked to as if the bear were another living entity to bring back Daddy. Years of survival passed by in a blur of time. Debra had moved on from being a stay-at-home mother to a full-time administrator at a local real estate office. The work wasn't something to dream about, but it paid the bills and kept the lights on. Her brother Patrick was an anchor through those stormy years. He became Alexander's surrogate father and helped him overcome his defiant period, as Carolyn was Debra's closest friend, offering emotional support when Debra was overwhelmed. Despite loving him every night, while her husband lay awake and stared into the ceiling, Debra couldn't help but often wonder where she was going wrong, how the man she loved could vanish into thin air and only leave pain in his wake. Until the one fateful evening when the phone rang. "Debra, it's Gregory." The voice at the other end sent shivers down her spine. She grasped the counter, trying to steady herself as memories surfaced. It had been 5 long years, and he asked to see her. "What do you want?" she said, her voice flat, emotionless. "I need to see you. Please, it's important," he begged, urgency lacing his tone. Important? The bitterness bubbled to the surface, and Debra almost laughed. Where was this urgency 5 years ago? Why now, Gregory? After all this time, why do you suddenly want to talk? There was a long pause on the other end, and Debra felt her heart race. "Please, just meet me tomorrow. I'll explain everything." She consented, albeit against her better judgment. Not because she thought he had a good enough reason to come after all these years, but because she wanted some answers. Those questions bothered her. She was still desperate to know what had made him leave. The afternoon following, Debra came to a small cafe near her office. She had chosen a neutral place to go if things became too overwhelming. She sat at a table by the window, her hands shaking slightly as she stirred the coffee, the steam rising to reach her face. The anticipation mixed with dread while her mind whirled with thoughts of memories of their life together, good and bad. As Gregory entered, her heart missed a beat. He was different, older and worn out. Gone was the confident man she once loved, but in his place was this person who looked so weighed down by life's choices. Dark circles framed his eyes, and the shadow of stubble on his jaw set off an alarm in her brain. As he approached her table, Debra traced the hesitation in his steps. He looked lost and almost fragile. "Debra," he started, but she cut him off. "Why are you here, Gregory? Why now after all this time?" He flinched at the words as if they hit him. "I know I'm not entitled to a second of your time, but I must explain. I owe you that much." Debra folded her arms across her chest, and her heart began to race in anger and confusion. "You owe me. You walked out without a word. You left me to raise our children alone." I know. He lilted in a low, pained tone. "I was lost. I didn't know what I was doing. Maria, she wasn't what I thought she would be. Debra shivered at the mention of Maria's name, the woman who had taken everything away from her. What about her? She asked icily. She left me, Gregory replied after a beat, his eyes down to his hands. She took everything, my savings, my business, everything. I am bankrupt. Debra nearly laughed out loud at the ironic twist of events. Here sat before her the man who had walked away from her, who had chosen another woman over his family, and who was now broke and desperate. So that is why you are here, she said, heavy with malice. Broke and you need something from me? No. Gregory immediately shook his head. It's not just that my mother, she's dying. Janet's mention was like a thorn deep inside Debra. Janet was always strong in Gregory's life, protecting him even when he didn't deserve that protection. They had not spoken since Gregory left, but it was hard to take in the news. She's leaving me the house, Gregory continued, his voice cracking. But it has a contingency. I have to reconcile with you and the kids. Otherwise it all goes to my brother Frank. Debra stared at him, incredulous. Was this a joke? The audacity. He had the nerve to show up after 5 years, not because he wanted to make amends, but because his mother held an inheritance over his head? The anger bubbled up inside her, threatening to overflow. You are unbelievable, she spat, her quivering voice laced with anger. You abandoned us. You left me to raise 2 kids on my own, and now you want me to take you back because you want a house? It's not like that, he pleaded, bending forward, desperation etched on his face. I made a mistake. I know that. But this could be a chance for us. For the kids. We could have a future together again. You wouldn't have to worry about money. We could live in the house. Debra abruptly stood and scratched the chair on the floor. I am not going to hear this anymore, she said as anger boiled in her veins. Taking her purse, she stormed out of the cafe, leaving Gregory behind with his well-timed pleas echoing into silence. Debra lay in bed that night, her mind mulling over the conversation a million times. The interior voice screamed to shut the door in his face once and for all. But another part of the part which had struggled all these years to keep her children fit and couldn't overlook the practicality of his offer. This wasn't just about her. This was about Alexander and Rachel. The inheritance Gregory was talking about would pay for their college and provide them with a stable home. Things she had worked so hard to give them, but never quite achieved. The following day, she called Patrick her rock through Gregory's abandonment. When she told him about Gregory's proposition, Patrick's reaction was immediate and furious. You've got to be kidding me, he spat. The man walks out on you and the kids, leaves you with nothing, and now he wants to return because he needs you to get some inheritance? That's disgusting, Debra. Don't let him manipulate you. I know, she sighed, rubbing her temples, but it's not that simple. The money could help the kids. We could finally have some security. And at what cost? Patrick asked. You've done fine without him for 5 years. You don't need his money. The kids don't need him. He's only thinking about himself. Debra knew he was right, but the decision was not black and white. She needed to speak with the children. That would have been fair to no one if she had made this decision without them. That evening, after dinner, Debra sat down with Alexander and Rachel. I have something I want to discuss with you about your father, she stammered, her heart pounding. Alexander's face fell hard, and Rachel's eyes went wide with curiosity. What now? Alexander snapped, heavy on the acid of contempt. Is he coming back to ruin our lives again? Gregory's called, reached out, Debra said quietly, struggling to contain her voice. He wants to meet. He's in a bad place. He needs us. What does that mean? Alexander burst out in anger. He doesn't get to just come back after all this time. Rachel cast her eyes down, her voice full of shakes. But I miss him. I want to know why he left. Debra's heart reached out to Rachel as she said, I know, honey, but we need to decide together as a family. I want you both to put in your opinion on this. Days passed, marked by tension and uncertainty. Debra felt like standing on the top of a cliff, not knowing if jumping would salvage her or destroy all that she had struggled to achieve. Finally, she got them together to confront Gregory. They needed to hear his promises for themselves to decide what they wanted going forward. But when they pulled into Janet's grand old estate, the memories came flooding back, and the atmosphere inside was cold and heavy. Gregory greeted them at the door, hope tangled with desperation in his eyes. "I want to make things right," he said. But Alexander's anger boiled over instantly. "You don't get to just walk back into our lives because you need something," he shouted, his fists clenched. "You left us. You left Mom. Now you want us to help you get a house?" Gregory winced at this and looked guilty. "I know I messed up," he said in a low tone. "But I want to be a father again." Rachel, her eyes welling with tears, tried to speak. "Why did you leave?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Didn't you love us?" Gregory's face crumpled. "I was selfish," he whispered. "I thought I could chase happiness, but I was wrong. I never stopped loving you, any of you." The words sounded hollow and empty. Debra could see it in her children's faces. The damage was done, and no amount of money or promises could repair it. Debra rose to her feet, her mind made up. "We don't need your money, Gregory," she said, her voice firm. "We've been just fine without you, and I'll continue to be fine without you. You made your choice 5 years ago. Now we're making ours." That said, Debra turned and walked out of the house with Alexander and Rachel close on her heels. As they drove away, a heavy sense of relief washed over her, to have finally closed the door on Gregory. Still, doubt pulled at her insides. Was this truly the right choice? Days passed, and weeks also started to pass. Life fell into the groove of a new routine, where home was silent, filled with laughter and joy, the occasional conflict that goes along with the territory when raising teenagers. Yet, the specter of Gregory somehow seemed to always stay in the background, casting aspersions of doubt over their happiness. Then one evening, the telephone rang. Debra hesitated as her heart pounded. The call was from Janet. "Debra, can we talk?" she asked, her voice shaking. "It's about Gregory." "What about him?" Debra replied, dread pooling in her stomach. "He's been in an accident." Janet's voice shook. "He's in the hospital." Debra's heart raced. She felt shock and a wave of guilt wash over her. Despite everything, he was the father of her children, and the thought of him suffering alone pulled on her heart. I can't just walk back into his life," Debra whispered, her eyes prickling with tears. "He needs you, Debra," Janet said, her tone thick with emotion. "He's asking for you." 1,000 thoughts were racing through her mind. Could she really turn her back on a dying person? She didn't know what to do as the conflict within her was tearing her apart. After an endless night of weighing and considering, Debra decided to talk with her children before she made a decision. They deserved to know what was happening. She called Alexander and Rachel together in the living room the next day. "We need to go see your father," she said softly. "He's in the hospital." Alexander's face hardened. "What? After everything he's done? Why should we care?" "I want to know why," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "I miss him." Conflicted emotions tore Debra between her children. She tried to appease them both. "I cannot pressure either of you into this," she said softly. "But neither would I want us to regret this afterward." After several minutes of silence, Alexander finally gave in. "Okay, but I won't fake it to make him happy." Debra drove them to the hospital, and her heart was beating in a way that threatened to burst out from between her ribs. Once inside, the sterile smell of disinfectant filled the air, while the hum of fluorescent lights reached across space. She approached the reception desk and cleared her throat. "How can I help you?" she asked a soft-eyed nurse. "I'm here to see Gregory Davis," Debra whispered. The sight that met their eyes as they entered Gregory's room was pathetic. Tied to his body were tubes and wires, and Gregory lay in bed so frail, pale against the crisp white sheets. For a moment, compassion tugged Debra's heart. "Debra?" His voice came out strained and weak. It cut through her like a knife. "Yes, it's me," she replied, her heart aching as she stepped closer. With an effort, he sat up, a pained look crossing his features. "I'm so glad you came." He sounded on the verge of breaking. "Why did you ask for us?" Alexander's voice was tight, and that anger was not yet resolved. Gregory's gaze darted between the two children. "I know I don't deserve this," he said, regret laced into his voice. "I've made awful mistakes, but I want to make things right. I need to apologize." Alexander stood tall, his arms crossed and his glare fixed on his father. "You don't just say sorry and expect everything to be okay," he spat, pain laced in his words. Gregory looked down, shame flooding his features. I know I hurt you. I can't change what happened, but I want to be there for you. I want to make things right." Rachel stepped closer to her father and asked in a quivering voice, "Why did you leave? Didn't you love us?" "I was lost," Gregory admitted in a practically whispered tone. "I thought I was chasing happiness, but I was wrong. I never stopped loving you, even when I was foolish." The air was thick with unspoken grief as Debra listened to the exchange. The possibility of healing hung palpably in the air, but it was encased in so much pain. "I wish things had been different," Gregory said, tears in his eyes. "I just wanted you to know that I love you both. I never stopped." Her heart ached as she saw her children standing up to face their father, with just a mix of emotions that indeed saturated the room. It was a moment of reckoning. It offered an opportunity for closure, but reminded them again of the losses they all had incurred. After a few moments, Debra said, "Gregory, we need time. You hurt us deeply, and though we're here, that does not mean everything is forgiven." "I understand," he said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted to tell you how sorry I am." As they prepared to leave, Debra turned back to look at Gregory, their history weighing on her. She didn't know if this would be the last time they saw him, but that chance weighed heavy on her heart. Days soon turned into weeks, and Gregory's condition kept going from bad to worse. The hospital became like home, as whispered conversations and tentative goodbyes from Debra and her children were normal. Every visit was like a farewell, and the uncertainty of his fate loomed above them like a storm cloud. It wasn't until one evening, while sitting by Gregory's bedside, that he reached for her hand and grasped it firmly but weakly. "Debra," he whispered, "I have to tell you something." "What is it?" Debra asked as her heart was pounding. "I don't have much time left," Gregory said, tears glistening. "I want you to promise me that you'll take care of the kids and be there for them. They need you." "Of course I will," Debra responded, tears streaming down her face. "You know I will always be there for them. Promise me that you'll let them know I loved them," he whispered, "even if I couldn't show it." "I promise," Debra said, heart aching from the weight of his words. Over the next several days, Gregory started weakening more and more. The prognosis was terrible, and the doctor could see very well that it was a matter of his dying. All this knowing hung in the air like a heavyweight. This sad truth seemed to be closing in the walls around her. The day came when the doctor sat Debra down, his face serious. "I'm so sorry, Debra," he said softly. "Gregory doesn't have much time left. It would be best if you and the kids came in and said your goodbyes." The words were like a blow to the stomach, and Debra's world spun around her. She nodded numbly, feeling the weight of grief settle heavily in her chest. It was over like that chapter she had hoped would end differently. It wasn't until that evening, when the family found themselves huddled in the hospital room, that the ache of her loss began to creep over her once more. Gregory lay frail, tubes attached to him. Such a great contrast from the man he had once been. Great tension hung in the air as they stood over him, heavy with words unspoken and emotions unprocessed. "I'm so proud of you all," Gregory whispered, his eyes sweeping over them. "I've always loved you, more than you'll ever know." Tears streamed down Debra's face as she looked at the man who had once been her partner, the father of her children. "We love you too," she said softly, her heart breaking. But deep inside, Debra knew that they would be required to make some other way without him, and that journey was abysmally frightening. Moments turned into hours as Debra held Gregory's hand, feeling the warmth dissipate as time slipped away. It was a moment of truth, one in which, despite everything, she still cared for the man who had once been her partner. "Thank you for being here," Gregory said in barely a whisper. "I'm glad you came. I am so sorry I couldn't do more for all of you." And then, in the silence of that hospital room, as the sun was dipping below the horizon, Gregory slipped away, taking with him the echoes of unfulfilled promises and unresolved pain. Debra felt her heart shatter as she realized the finality. They had faced the truth, taken steps toward healing, and were left with the void he created. His absence weighed heavily upon them, a grim reminder of what could have been. Debra and her children accommodated the loss in the following days, and lived a new life without Gregory, They shared stories about him, reminiscing about the good times while acknowledging the hurt he had caused. It was bittersweet, filled with the turmoil of love, loss, and longing for closure. But as time moved along, the agony of their loss lingered on. The love they had shared with Gregory would forever be tinged with the bitter pain of his betrayal. Debra knew it would take time to heal as the seasons passed again. They had started to forge a new way, but the scars would always remain. During quiet moments, she would think of Gregory, the father of her children, a man who made her life a mixture of joy and pain. She could not let go of the hope that they would find a way forward together despite heartbreak. Each night, putting her children to bed, Debra would lean down and whisper into their ears the promise of eternal love and support. No matter what happens, I will always be here for you. The future was not assured. However, together, they would travel through the labyrinth called their lives, carrying in their chests the load of love and the ache of loss. The finely closed chapter of Gregory and his complicated legacy had taught her that love could be a gift and a curse. There was no clarity as to their future. It would be day by day, together, healing, remembering, forging anew with them the ache of what could have been the bittersweetness.